So, you're a GT3 main in the Lemont Ultimate, but you want to venture out into the wild, you want to try new cars, you want to try the LMP3, the LMP2, and the Hypercar. What do you need to know if you're making that transition? What sort of things do you need to learn and take into consideration that you wouldn't do for LMGT3s? Well, today, let's find out. I'm Luke Whitehead and you're watching the Coach David Lemont Ultimate YouTube channel. So, before we get into the nuances of how to drive these cars differently and how the experience is going to differ from class to class, we need to go over the mechanical differences between the cars to understand how you need to adapt and what things you need to bear in mind when moving from the GT3s to the prototype classes. So, obviously, aside from the really generic stuff and the stuff that is kind of obvious, we have the electronics, which obviously the GT3 has much more hand holding. You have the ABS system, which you don't obviously have in the NMP2s, the NMP3s, or the Hypercars. You also only have regen and electric motor maps in the Hypercars, with the exception of the Aston Valkyrie. Differential is where it gets a little bit complicated, but we'll come back to that once we're going over everything else. The diff preload is available in all cars, which is nice, except for the BMW M4 LMGT3, because obviously that car has a welded diff, which means you can't adjust your off throttle and on throttle rotation, which is a bit annoying. So kind of with that car, what you get is what you get. Brake migration you only get in the Hypercars, and that essentially means that only in the Hypercars can you adjust how much more brake bias shifts during the braking phase. So when you brake into the corner, as you trail off towards the corner, if you have it on 2.5% frontwards brake migration, the brake bias will migrate forwards by that percentage. So for example, if you're on 53.0 brake bias, as you trail into the corner, the brake bias will move towards 50.5% to make the entry phase a little bit more responsive and improve trail braking and how much rotation you get on the brake into the mid corner. And then of course you have gear ratio changes, which the GT3 and the LMP3 do not have. And the NMP2 is the most open with how much you can change the gear ratio. Obviously, you have slow speed, high speed, and Le Mans, and you can change any of those gear ratios at any circuit. Whereas I believe the Hypercar is a bit more restricted in that sense. Then the mechanical grip, you have the third spring. And essentially what the third spring does is it limits the amount that the car pitches, particularly at high speed. So in ultra layman's terms, if you have stiffer third spring, it will pitch less. And if you have a very soft third spring, it will pitch more. So a lot of it controls the high-speed pitch. So down the straight, if you're bottoming out, you'll generally stiffen the third spring to avoid the bottoming. And it also just makes rotation and, it helps you control rotation, particularly on throttle and under braking. So when you're using the pedals, that is when it will be most effective. So what you'll see in the Hypercars especially is you'll see how it have quite a soft front third spring and quite a stiff rear third spring, just to make the car rotate a little bit more, while having safer corner spring setups to make the car a little bit safer, on the entries, but more aggressive on the exits. Anti-roll bar, it can be adjusted in all cars, pretty self-explanatory, and then obviously the aero as well. Only the Valkyrie and the Peugeot, wingless Peugeot, have different aero adjustments. They only have the front diffuser, but they don't have a rear wing, whereas every other car is exactly the same. And now let's roll back to that diff preload and the locking that I wanted to discuss. So coast locking is relatively self-explanatory. If you have lower coast locking, then you have more oversteer off throttle or more rotation off throttle. But then if you have a higher coast locking value, you will have less rotation off throttle. The power locking is a little bit more complicated. So I've actually got to read something here because I don't fully understand it myself, but I've asked someone who does, and they've explained it to me. So if you have a low power locking, you have oversteer immediately after the apex on the power, and the car transitions to understeer as you exit the corner more. Whereas if you have a high power value, you get more understeer initially after the apex as you touch the throttle, but then the car starts to oversteer in the later exit phase. So in ultra layman's terms, if the car's a little bit twitchy in the later exit phase, you want to lower that power locking. So it's quite complicated, and it's something that you will definitely need to learn and experiment with if you want to move into the higher classes and understand, really get the maximum out of those classes. So let's get into the driving side and see what sort of things we can discover after driving all four classes. So, to give us a little understanding of the GT3s and how they drive so that we have something to compare to when we jump into the other classes, we're going to be driving the BMW M4 LMGT3 around Barcelona, so let's see how that treats us. So let's do a couple of laps in the GT3 to set a baseline for what to expect in this car and what to compare with once we go to the other classes. So, first thing to mention is that obviously in online races above bronze, you're not going to have any tyre warners, so that applies for all cars, which means you can have not a lot of grip for the first few laps. But where the differences do start to come in is how the cars heat their tyres up, how quickly they actually get up to temperature, and just in general how much grip they actually provide when the tyres are cold. So you can see for the GT3, for example, yes, there's a lot less grip than obviously what you would have on warm tyres, but there's still more than enough to get around the track safely. I think that's one of the big things that differentiates it against the prototypes, particularly the LMP2 and the Hypercar. We can see, we are skating around a little bit, but the car is pretty usable, and that's kind of how it should be, obviously. The GT3s, they are essentially the entry class in ELMS and in WEC. Obviously, it's got the anti-lock brakes, as we mentioned earlier. So, obviously, it's a lot more easy under braking. Requires a lot less finesse. You really can stamp that brake pedal. And you don't have to be as careful under braking to not lock your tyres, because it's never really going to happen. And obviously, because the cars are they're quite heavy, they're quite large, a lot less low to the ground, they do generally handle quite a bit more lazily than the prototype cars. Again, it's by design. Obviously, they're meant to be the entry-level class, so... And as you can see, they're also a lot slower than the LMP2s. At least the M's LMP2, which is the one we just got taken by. But yeah, the car handles a lot more lethargic. It's quite slow in the way that it moves around. It's not particularly twitchy. Obviously, we're driving the BMW right now, which is one of the cars that heats its tyres up pretty quickly. But just as an example, if we look at the tyres now after one lap, we're around 60 degrees on the left side. And the optimal is around 75 to 80 degrees, something along those lines. So you can see that, yes, the BMW obviously here heats its tyres up very quickly, but even so, that's a massively quick increase in temperature. You can already see we're getting quite a bit of grip to kind of attack these corners. Okay, gets out of the way, thank you. So that's kind of what I wanted to show on this lap or this driving session to begin with, because it's a very, very big difference that the GT3s have, and it often catches people out, particularly in multi-class races when there's GT3s, Hypercars and whatnot. It's just how quick the tyres get up to temperature in GT3s compared to the other classes. I think we're going to do probably one more lap, and that'll probably be enough to kind of show what I'm talking about. But you can already see, we are, 67 degrees on the left side, so probably one or two more laps will be there. Unless we've, fully open ducts on race fuel at a track that I've not driven a huge amount. Obviously, Barcelona being quite a new track, so we're not pushing that hard. And even then, we're already almost at the the point where we can start full pushing. Nearly get pole driven by that LMP2. That's pretty sketchy. But that's also the other thing with the GT3s that's very different to the other classes, obviously. Being the slowest class, you're looking in your mirrors constantly. You've got to be really on your A game, because it's so easy to just not see one of these LMP2s or even LMP3s coming up behind you. Look at the speed difference that they carry through there. So it's a very different driving experience to what you would have in other classes, and it's something that, again, people do really struggle with. But obviously in multi-class races you have to be a lot more proactive. But as far as the driving goes, the GT3s are a lot less complicated than the prototypes. They tend not to bite too hard. You can get quite a bit of movement out of them. They do have quite a bit of lateral movement and a bit of you know, they do slide on the front and the rear, and obviously they do have quite a bit of body roll, being an actual car, as opposed to a rocket ship with wheels on in the case of the LMGT2 Elms. Obviously the big thing with the GT3s as well is that you do have to be a lot more. You have to be a lot more patient with the car in some cases, because obviously the car, it's going to be a lot less direct and a lot less responsive. So you need to kind of wait for the car to actually pitch into the corners. You can't just chuck it in and instantly be there, like you can in the LMP2 and Hypercars. We'll do one more lap. We'll just kind of see if we can get those tyres up into the optimal window. Yeah, this is lap 4 now. Still getting a bit of understeer. And I think that's also front engine and setup related. So this is meant to be a relatively safe setup. And yeah, you can see 84 degrees on the left front. Obviously that's partially because we're scrubbing the fronts quite heavily. But it's only taken just over 3 full laps, including our outlap, to get the tyres up to temperature, which really isn't that long in the grand scheme of things. Bit of a mistake there, but there you go. That's kind of the idea that I wanted to kind of demonstrate. Is within 4 laps we're able to push, relatively hard with the car. The tyres are in that window, and let's have a look now and contrast that with some of the other classes in the game. So, in the interest of fairness, I've tried to replicate the weather conditions as much as I can from that server session we were in, because that server is now not available to me, unfortunately. But it's as close as I can get, I think. Again, no tyre warmers, race fuel. We're using the CDA balance setup once again. So, keeping as many variables as we can, being the same. Again, just in the interest of fairness. Obviously, we haven't got any cars to negotiate, which makes it a little bit easier on my brain, not having to look in the mirrors and whatnot. But yeah, the first thing you'll notice is that the car obviously just has a lot more grip. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, right? But the car's obviously a lot lower to the ground. I believe it's actually less powerful than the GT3s, but I need to check. But regardless, the car has more aero and it's lower to the ground, more nimble, and just in general is just more grippy everywhere. And that really helps when it comes to having cold tyres, because you can feel when you're driving, and you probably can't see it when I'm driving, but the cold tyres are pretty slidey in the LMP3 to begin with. Obviously they do start same temperature as the GT3s, around 20 degrees when you come out the pits, but they do take a little bit longer to build up temperature, which means that the tyres themselves don't give full grip for probably 5 or 6 laps or so. But obviously the one caveat with that is that because we have more aero and more mechanical grip, the car feels like it comes to you a lot quicker, which obviously inspires quite a lot of confidence to push the car harder. But then of course that wears the tyres, so it is in that sense a bit harder to gauge how much grip you have unless you know the car really well. And fortunately, a little tidbit about myself is that this is probably my favourite car to drive in LMU, the GS specifically. I'm not too keen on the Ginetta. Haven't driven the Queen yet, obviously it's quite a new car, but the LMP3 I find very satisfying to drive, I find very satisfying to drive. Because although it's relatively user-friendly, I believe, like if you can get past the lack of the ABS, which we mentioned earlier, The actual stability of the car is quite nice. You know, the car is inherently a bit understeery, which I do think is quite a nice thing. But what you'll notice about the braking trace that's very different to the GT3s, and it's something I'll go over in the Delta app after driving some laps, is that the brake trace, we have quite a hard initial hit, and then it trails off quite quickly, but also quite, you know, gradually or as linearly as possible. And that's because, again, we don't have that ABS to fall back on. You know, in the GT3s, you can really mash the brake pedal, and, you know, there's not much need or necessity to trade off that brake super early unless you're in low grip conditions or in a car like the Ford or Lexus, which pitches quite aggressively. So in general, you're, you know, having to be a lot more proactive and a lot more smooth on the braking and a lot more finesse, you know, have a lot more finesse on the braking, which is probably why the LMB3 is not driven very much, because that does make it very, very difficult, especially at tracks like Portimao, where, you know, you're constantly at quite low speed, and obviously at the lower speed you're going, the easier it is to lock the brake. And obviously with the LMP3s and LMP2s and such on LMU, it's really easy to get micro locking, which is, you know, the really small lockup, which does wear your tyres a bit and just does, you know, inhibits your braking performance. You know, I will probably get one on this run, to be honest, but I'll be sure to let you know if that does happen. But you can see now, the tyres still aren't really there. You know, at low speed, we're still lacking quite a bit of grip. And at high speed, the car's still a little bit nervous. And we had a little micro lock there. You might have heard it over my yapping. But the main, yeah, as I say, the main thing is the tyres still aren't quite there, and you can feel they're not quite there. But because of, you know, like at high speed, for example, the aero tends to take over a bit. And you do still have pretty decent grip. Another thing to also note, which will be important for races if you're trying to make your own setup or, you know, adapt the setup the Coach Dave offers, is that the rears do heat up quite a bit more than the fronts, and generally that can lead to a bit of imbalance. I generally haven't had any issues with that, but, you know, if the track's a bit colder or whatnot, you might need to up the ducts on the front just to kind of balance the tyre temps out a little bit. Okay, you can see now the time we gained through those last couple of corners was quite significant, because the tyres are starting to come into their own a bit more now. A bit of understeer there. That is one thing I will say about this car that I do, about the LMP3s that I do struggle with a little bit, is that, you know, you feel, the car feels very, you know, pointy and responsive on the initial turn-in, and that makes you feel like you can really push, you know, the entry more and more and more every single time. But the car, you know, has a very small window that you can actually exploit, you know, when you're driving. So the car does tend to push on if you overstep that margin by even a little bit. And obviously because it doesn't have the mechanical grip, you know, or the aero of the LMP2 and the Hypercars, it feels, you know, a lot more restrictive in that sense, because you have a much smaller window to play with and a lot less grip to play with, even though it feels so responsive on the initial. And I think that kind of is one of the main reasons why a lot of people really struggle with the LMP3s above, you know, the LMP2 and then in the Hypercars, which in my opinion are actually more difficult cars to drive than the LMP3. But I think a lot of people just, on the initial entry, the car does bite in quite aggressively, and you just expect it to have more grip, and it just doesn't. You know, obviously these cars are meant to be the precursor to the LMP2 Elms, and they're meant to be the follow-on from the GT3s. They're meant to slot right in that little gap for the Elms Championship. And they do that very nicely, but obviously it is very difficult to try and jump up from the GT3 to the LMP3, because they're not much faster. They feel a lot more responsive, obviously, but they're not much faster than the GT3s, and obviously they lack the ABS. So it's a lot of things to consider. And obviously, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the added complexity of the setup with the, you know, extra diff settings with the coast and power locking, and the extra third spring settings as well. You know, you have more to think about in general. And then add to that, obviously, the linked traction control, which obviously limits, you know, means you can't individually adapt the slip angle traction control. It's linked to the TC 1 setting. I can't remember what the name of it was. But you see here, we've only got traction control and cut. You can't actually change the slip angle or anything like that. So it just in general gives you less to play with. And less to kind of refine to make your job easier. Okay, let's stop yapping for a bit. Let's see if we can push for a bit of a more aggressive lap. But one thing I will say is we're only 78 degrees on the left front, so we're still not in that window on the right side tyres. And we've done, we're about to complete our 7th, or I think, well, 7th lap it says, but I don't think we start on that. I think it's probably our 4th or 5th lap. I will double check in the Delta app how many laps we've actually completed. But again, the left side's only just getting into that range. Which is obviously in contrast to the GT3s, which only took really 3.5 laps. Bit of wash there. Also, the other thing that is very difficult as well when going from GT3 to the LMP3 is curb usage. I mean, the GT3 should be all over that left-hand entry curb, and also in the first chicane, you saw we kind of fell off of the curves when we tried to take them because we don't have high enough ride height. This front ride height I think is around 42, 43 millimeters, and then you look at the GT3s and they're always over 50. So that's 10 mil of difference almost, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, it makes a hell of a difference. Even on flat curbs, it makes a big difference. That was a bit slow. A little early. Oh, a bit of a slide there. But yeah, the overall trend is this car really doesn't hold your hand as much as the GT3 does, which I think makes it a very good car to build up from if you want to venture into those LMP2s and Hypercars. We'll do one more lap because the tyres I think are still getting there. Slightly better curb usage there. Yeah, I missed the apex a little bit there. Again, a bit wide. Bit too much exit curb. It's not a great lap so far. Okay, let's try and get this corner better. That was much better. There we go, look at that. Let's turn it a little bit later. Also, something I completely forgot to mention is that the LMP3, at least the Ligier I believe, is a right-hand drive. So I kind of had this issue in ACC when switching to the Bentley, because that car was right-hand drive and it often threw me for a loop. It's probably another thing worth considering when you're deciding which cars to drive. There we go, that was a better lap. 0.4. But again, you saw after, we're 89 now on the left side, or left front, 91 on the left rear. But that's after... Actually, let me just check how many laps that actually is. Right, there we go. So this is the run that we just did, the 36.4 as we've seen. So yeah, so the lap 3 was our out lap. So we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 laps. 6 or 7 laps until the tyres were up to temperature, and we were still going quicker. So again, you compare that to the GT3, so it's 3.5 or 4 laps. So it's pretty much twice as long that the LMP3 is taking. And again, that was hot conditions, you know, around 27 degrees air temp and around 40 degrees track temp. So, and again at Barcelona, which is quite a high tire deck circuit. So it's definitely a big change. And another thing I obviously wanted to compare and contrast was the brake traces. You know, this turn one is a little bit strange. I don't know what that little spike is in there, but you see the rest of them, you know, very high peak, and then you trail off gradually as you get to the corner. Same with the next corner. Same with the next corner. You know, you get the idea. You know, with very high peak, and then you trail off quite quickly. And then if we compare that to the BMW here, obviously the lap's not particularly great. But if we look at the you know, you can see it's a much wider peak at the brake trace and a much faster trail off. You know, whereas the LMP3 was a very high peak. You know, kind of more like these. You know, more like this peak. But it was like that for every corner, whereas these were a much wider, much less precise, much chunkier brake trace. Which is, you know, a massive benefit of the ABS is that you can just use that brake and be a lot less precise and a lot less finessing on the brake pedal. So let's move a class up now. We've got the NMP2 Elms car now to try. And then we'll have a brief look at the Hypercar as well. Okay, now when I said that we're moving up a class, you could argue that this is actually taking 2 jumps. Because the Elms NMP2 is actually faster than the Hypercars at quite a lot of circuits. Because it has more aero, more downforce, and just in general more grip in the corners. But, you know, we've started in the GT3, we've gone to the Elms upper class in the LMP3, and then we're going up another class in the Elms category with the LMP2. So, and ultimately this is my video, I'm deciding how we do it. So again, same conditions as we were last time. But let's see how this car feels on cold tyres. Now, truth be told, this is not a car I've driven a great deal. I've not driven it a huge amount, so the chances are I'm going to probably not drive it optimally, and I'm probably not going to set the world alight. However, I've driven enough of it to know what sort of things to look out for and what sort of things to expect. And the first of those is obviously the much more aggressive power curve and the amount more power that we have. You know, compared to an MP3, this car has vastly more power, which means that the car is a lot more twitchy on exits. You have to be a lot more on your toes, especially at high speed, because the car is just super responsive and super aggressive, particularly on throttle, as I mentioned. So, and again, this car has no ABS, so while it does have more aero, it still doesn't have any more electronic aids than the LMP3. Still no regen or motor map or anything like that. It's a fully natural ICE, like the GT3 and LMP3. And also, like the LMP3, it has the same linked TC system, which means that you can't specifically change the slip angle traction control setting, which is honestly a bit annoying in my opinion, because I think if any car needs, you know, some adjustments to slip angle, it's this one, because this car really is pretty twitchy. But it's okay. It's how they made it. It's how it is IRL, so we just need to cope with it and deal with it. But yeah, so as you can see, similar kind of sentiment to the LMP3 in that, you know, the tyres you can feel at low speed especially don't really respond just yet. The car is definitely a little bit sketchy and kind of doesn't do anything at low speed. You can see here, we're going to turn quite a lot and wait quite a lot for the tyres to get to actually grip up. And as you see, these are certainly not the worst cold tyres in LMU, or certainly not the most difficult, I should say. But again, at high speed, those issues don't persist too much because of how much aero we have and how much downforce we've got. So it's similar to LMP3, whereby we have the aero to kind of overtake the lack of grip the tyres have at this moment in time. But again, at low speed, the grip just isn't really there. See, at high speeds the car is much faster and much more responsive than the LMP3. It's a massive, massive step, really. I mean, we saw with the BMW, obviously that reference up was a 42 point something, 0.7. Let's just say 142 for the sake of argument. The LMP3 was a 136, so that's, you know, a 6-second gain. But it, you know, the faster you get, the harder it becomes to make that jump, that lap time jump. Which makes it all the more impressive that this car I've seen doing 127s. So it's definitely a bit of a bigger jump from the LMP2 to the LMP3 versus the LMP3 to the GT2. Oh, GT3, sorry. A lot of numbers, easy to get mixed up. But just the general trend is that this car is just a lot more brutal than the LMP3. You know, the LMP3 is essentially a baby prototype, but it handles... It's just a lot more, you know, safe. You know, it doesn't really scare you when you're driving it. You know, you haven't got enough power really to do that. It's obviously got quite a, you know, muted V6 engine. Hasn't got the best, most aggressive brakes, so you know you have quite long braking zones and you don't carry huge amounts of entry speed. Just in general, it's quite a comfortable car to drive. You don't feel like you're, you know, it's not going to bite you back super hard. Whereas this car, you get the sense that it's trying to kill you. Is really the sense that I get whenever I drive it. You know, you really feel like the car is just waiting for an opportunity to bite back in a bad spot and spit you straight into the nearest wall. See just how much better the brakes are, and again, tyres still aren't fully there in my opinion in terms of temperature, and that's without looking at the HUD. I can just feel they're not quite there. You can see, yep, we're about 10 degrees below. But you can see again, even with that, look how short the brake distances are. You know, we're braking pretty much at the corner relative to where we were braking the GT3 and the Hypercar, or the MP3, sorry. And again, it's just the fact that we've got so much aero. There's so much aerodynamics, so much downforce, and again, still no ABS, so we're still having to be quite refined under braking like we were in the LMP3. But we're able to brake so much deeper, so much later into the corner, just because of how much more grip we have. Yeah, we're just about to go on to lap 5. So again, we're still a couple of laps behind where the GT3 was in terms of temperatures. You know, they were already well and truly cooking at this point. But just in general, you've got to, you know, drive the car very, very differently to what you would in the GT3. You know, in the GT3, you turn the car with the steering wheel. And it sounds relatively obvious and self-explanatory, but with the LMP3 and even more so the LMP2, you really do turn with the pedals. You know, you rotate the car on entry with the brake, you rotate the car on exit with the throttle. You know, you really don't use too much steering lock, and you can probably see that with my heads-up display and also with my steering inputs in general. You really don't use that steering wheel very much. And again, like the LMP3, you're trying to keep off those curbs a bit. I basically disobeyed my own instruction there, unfortunately, but... Well, that curve was definitely not the one. And again, this is a relatively, you know, a setup made to be relatively benign, relatively user-friendly. And even I'm having a bit of a workout here with the car. Not because it's particularly sketchy. I mean, I feel like if you were using a properly, fully fledged esports setup, you'd be, you know, I'd be panting and kind of sweating out my pants. But right now, you know, even though the car is relatively stable, I still have a lot of work, you know, that I'm putting in. You know, you just get the sense that even the slightest mistake is going to have enormous consequences. Quite a big hook over that curve, which was nice. Definitely wasn't the fastest way to do it, but made me feel nice and comfortable. Okay, we can see now though our tyres are at temperature, but you can already see Now that tyres are actually at the temperature window, they've already worn down by a significant amount. You know, 95% on the left front, 93% on the left rear. So you can already see that, like, yeah, we've got the tyres at temperature on the 5th or 6th lap, but the tyres are already past their best, which is a massive, massive thing. And you know, it's not the last time we'll come into that issue. That's for sure. That being said, though, we are definitely in that stage now where the car is providing more grip than it was on the previous laps. A bit of a slide into the corner there. Somehow worked. It didn't feel fast, but apparently it was quicker than what I was doing before. But you see what I mean? You know, we're not doing a huge amount with the steering. We're almost neutral steering on the exit. On the entry, you know, we're flicking the steering ever so slightly, but we're using the brake into the corner to really rotate that car more so. Which is a very, very different methodology to the GT3s. I also keep wanting to shift it to 7th there because I'm so used to having the Hypercars having an extra gear, or you know, the GT3s you shift up to 6th quite late on that straight, so obviously this setup is on the shorter gear stack, which I felt to be a little bit better on this track. Just in terms of, you know, the amount you could use the engine braking, the low speed rotation and whatnot, just felt a little bit nicer in sector 2. Bit of a kick oversteer there. Okay, I think the tyres are officially past their best. 89 on the left side's temperature. Yeah, they definitely feel like they're past their best, and I am also past my best a little bit. So, just a much more intense experience, really, with this car. But again, you know, it still took 6 or so laps, or 5 or 6 laps to get the tyres up to temperature, which is a you know, very big thing with these cars. Despite it being, again, a hot track, and despite it being Barcelona, which is notoriously tough on its tyres. So, let's have a look at Coast Dave Delta and compare those brake traces once again. So the main difference between the LMP2 and the LMP3 is the braking. The steering is actually a lot more similar than I thought it was. I went back and looked. In general, it seems that my initial application of the steering in the LMP2 was a little bit more aggressive. Obviously, because the car has a lot more grip and it's more responsive, you can make use of that. You can be a little bit more aggressive with the car. And obviously, because the car is so much faster, you have to be a lot more on your toes than in the LMP3. But what I noticed was that at the high-speed braking zones, so into turn 1 and also into the final sector, this awkward left-hander, what I noticed was that the brake trace peaks a lot higher in the LMP2. So we're able to smash that brake a lot harder than the LMP3. And that's because we're approaching the corner with a much higher speed, which obviously means that the brakes are less likely, or the tyres are less likely to lock up at that speed. But also because of the aerodynamics, we have a lot more downforce in the LMP2 Elms car versus the LMP3, which means that you can be more aggressive on those brakes than you can on the LMP3. And additionally, obviously, we have much shorter braking zones. You can see we're braking and, you know, trading off deeper into the corner, but, you know, still having a relatively short braking zone. So let's try the Hypercar now and see if we can really bridge the gap between these different cars and see what changes we need to make from car to car. So let's try the Hypercar now. So one thing you're probably already noticing is this car and this class in general is a far cry from the LMP2, LMP3 and GT3. Because my goodness, there is no grip. On these cold tyres, it is brutal. It's really hard to feel any sort of confidence for the first few laps because the tyres just do not want to cooperate. And obviously with the added factor or the maintained factor from the LMP2 and MP3, we don't have ABS. So, you know, these tyres are absolutely brutal to drive on, have no grip. And because we're carrying such low cornering speed, it's even easier to lock the brakes and grab a wheel, which means that you have, you know, permanent flat spots and whatnot for the rest of the stint, which is obviously not what you want. But yeah, these tyres are very, very brutal. They take a lot of finesse and a lot of patience, as you will see. I believe it takes probably 6 or so laps to get the tyres at temperature. Of course, we're going to find out. But unlike the LMP2 and LMP3, where the lack of grip kind of got overtaken by the amount of downforce you had, because these cars have a little less downforce than the LMP2 and are, you know, quite chunky, they're quite big cars with all the hybrid technology and whatnot in them, they don't tend to have that luxury. So you can see even through turn 3 where we were, you know, having pretty good grip in the LMP2, we don't have that here, at least not yet. So it is a very, very different beast. Even though the LMP2s are faster, this is definitely the more brutal and challenging experience. And of course, some of that comes down to the Genesis, you know, being very, very snappy, as you can probably see from my inputs and just from the responsiveness and the behaviour of the car. But obviously, add to the fact that, you know, the braking zone is significantly longer than the LMP2s. The cornering speed's lower, the grip level's lower, but of course we've got more power, so we are quite a bit quicker down the straight. I believe it was around 292 or so we were hitting in the Elms LMP2. Let's see what we hit here, because again, the exit wasn't that great because we were still on cold tyres. We were already at what the top speed was in the Elms LMP2. Yeah, we're at 302. So, you know, we're 10k up pretty much. And again, this is pretty much maximum wing. So if we went, you know, more aggressive setup on lower wing, we'd be doing even quicker than that. So it's over 10k's quicker than the LMP2. And again, you can really feel that extra power on exits where the rear is really twitching quite a lot. And obviously with these cars, again, you have just less grip in the corners, so you have to really point and squirt the car. And it's just a lot more challenging, a lot more technical. Even if it is, in my opinion, a bit less scary. You know, I think the LMP2 is a more scary experience because of how dicey the car is and how just generally snappy and, you know, twitchy it is. You know, everything happens, you do everything a lot quicker and a lot sharper in the LMP2, in my opinion at least. I know that's probably going to be an unpopular take. Another thing also worth mentioning is that, like the LMP2 and LMP3, this car kind of hates curbs, as you will probably see in the in one of the clips. There was a clip on my previous run where I didn't do particularly well in this car. I keep picking the wrong brake marker for turn 1. It's a little bit annoying, but completely my issue. There we go. Bit of a slide on the exit, which is nice though. A bit deep. I think the main thing that I find in the Hypercars is you just expect the brake to be better. You know, you expect to hit the brake and for it to just respond instantly and start slowing down, and it kind of doesn't. It just keeps going, particularly into this corner where, you know, I've completely missed the braking point as if to completely missed the apex, sorry, to almost illustrate my point unintentionally. And we just completely skateboarded that curb, just like we did earlier. Obviously we're driving the Genesis as well, which is the brand new Hypercar. Very challenging car, honestly. It is very distinct and very unique to drive, which I I really like, and I think that's something that we kind of miss in the LMP2s and LMP3s. Well, yes, there are different cars in LMP3s. They all handle more or less the same. You just have small quirks here and there. Whereas the Hypercars all feel distinctly different, which is why I really like the GT3s, even though those distinctions and differences end up making for bad balancing at times. But I like the uniqueness and the individuality of the cars. And again, the Genesis definitely feels the most unique out of the Hypercars that I've tried. That to say, it is very, very challenging to drive. Even if you don't really have to think too much about the motor map situation, because the battery, as you can see, is staying relatively good in the middle. Which is important, because if you go too low on the battery or too high, the car will just start reacting really poorly under braking, which is not something you need in these cars. The tyres are up to temperature now on the left side. Right side is still a little cold. Inside curb was not the one. Understeer. I keep trying to take. The problem is I keep trying to take these high-speed corners like I could in the Elms NMV2, and you just can't because you don't have that grip. We'll try and do one more lap, see if we can maybe dip into the 29s like I did the other day for the lap guides. No, we cannot. We cannot. But regardless, we've got some good data to go off. I will probably look at the fastest lap that I did the other day for the brake pressure, to show the brake traces, etc. So it was definitely a better driven lap. But yeah, you definitely get the sense from that of how hard these cars are to drive. They definitely aren't for the weak-hearted, that's for sure. Goodness, I'm gonna go have a drink. That was brutal. Okay, so looking at the brake traces and the sort of inputs that we're doing with the Hypercar, you'll notice again, so from the LMP3, obviously we had quite low peaks and very, spiky brake traces, kind of like a, almost like a triangle. Whereas with this, it's the same sort of thing, but a lot more upscaled. So, higher brake pressure again, even than the LMP2. But again, we're trading even longer. So just as the car's gotten, quicker down the straights and, at least in the Hypercars example, it's quicker down the straights, but less grippy in the corners. We're having to trail longer, spend longer on the brake with higher pressure than in the LMP2, just to make sure we actually make the corners, which is a very, very big thing. And obviously with the steering as well, you can see we're really jaggedy. We're constantly reacting to the car and correcting the oversteer. And again, that is car specific to an extent. Obviously the Genesis is a very snappy car, as we saw on those laps. But it's definitely one of those where the Hypercar does move around more than the LMP2. Obviously, it is heavier, has less downforce, so you'd expect that. But it is definitely a misconception because, again, for the last couple of years on the old tyre on the Hypercar, or the older sort of model of the tyre, the Hypercar was quicker than the LMP2. And while it did move around, it was a lot more glued to the ground. The car would kind of slide in a slip angle, and that it would just stick like that, which obviously now is not the case with the new tyre model, which was updated relatively recently in the grand scheme of things. But I think it's for the better, and surprisingly enough, despite the lack of grip we had on the tyres for the first few laps, you can see my runs are about 6 laps. So out lap 1, 2, 3, 4 actually. So 5 laps total. And then the tyres are up to temperature, which is, again, quicker than we had in the LMP3 and the LMP2, which is quite a surprise given how far off the lap times are initially. So I guess that's because, the car probably has more power, has more weight, so there's more energy going through the tyre. So in that sense, it does make sense. So there we have it. The setup and driving differences between all the main different classes that are used on Le Mans Ultimate. The GT3s, LMP3s, LMP2, Elms cars, and Hypercars. A lot of big differences, obviously, with the electronics being different in most of the cars. Obviously, the introduction of the third spring and the different differential settings. There's a lot to think about, but I think that given enough time and having enough patience with the cars and how much more difficult they are to drive in the GT3s, you'll be up to speed in no time. So if this video helped, please leave a like, subscribe if you're new. Make sure to click this video in the top left of your screen if you want to see this week's daily races with Barcelona, where I go into more detail on how to drive that track specifically, as well as some of the other tracks. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.